sharpen my knife whenever I revisit them, the knife being my skill set. So I want to talk a little bit about analyzing lines and how they're used. So here we have like some mythological creatures, and this is some pretty primitive work. There's no cross hatching involved. It's all single line hatching. It's all single feathering, you might call it. And it works really brilliantly. You have this great three-dimensional effect that's created just by contrasting light and dark. Also notice that the artist tends to have the same direction. They have, sometimes it's called unidirectional lines, where you have all of the lines, like this line here on this man's calf, it's the same as the lines on this character's calf, on this character's entire leg, on this character's upper arm. So 70% of those lines, the artist picked a direction and then continued to go with it. So it's whenever they didn't know what else to do, they just fell back into the kind of predominant line pattern. But when you go to the background, you have these build-up lines, and because they're all horizontal, they contrast really beautifully if the figures and pop them out. So this is like a really reductive image, because there's not, with all of the things you could do with hatching, they're only, or feathering, or whatever you want to call it, they're not doing any crisscrossing lines. If they want to get darker, they'll kind of bunch them up so that they're so close together, they kind of subtly form a black. And even within that limitation, you get this great 3D effect, this entire leg. If you were to copy this leg, you would have a really interesting experience breaking down exactly how shadow is used to create a three-dimensional illusion. Another thing you're going to find with a lot of the work we're going to look at here is there's a real simple device that a lot of these old-timey artists used. Let's make the back leg and the back arm and this back leg all shady, all more shadowed. This guy's back arm too. Those things are turned away from us more, so they're darker. And that makes them feel like they're further back. And it makes the front leg, which is half light, half dark, it supports it. It gives it more of a sense of range. This feels even more 3D because it's next to something which is entirely dark. This one on the left, this is interesting too. You have this demon creature over here. And one of the earliest things that I kind of struggled with when I started learning about how to shade from your imagination is the idea that, let me see if I can do this. This is a really bad pen, but just so I don't have to switch screens. We all start off drawing where you might look at a bottle or something like that in a still life, and there's always a strong light coming from one side, and the bottle will have shadow that's only on one side. And in reality, you don't always have a strong direct light source. So while you usually do have a side that's more shadowed than the other, sometimes you have shadows on the left side as well. Just it might be they might be shorter, which gives you the sense that the whole thing is that the light is generally coming from this side, but it's not so strong that it's completely bleaching out that side. So that's what you see here. But you could also say, well, maybe this is a situation where here the light's coming from above and a little bit from the left, but this like loincloth thing is blocking this leg. So you're getting shadow on both sides of this thigh. And here too, the loincloth is leaving a cast shadow because it's above it. And here, maybe this bird head is leaving a shadow on the snake. Or maybe the snake's scales are dark. It's hard to say. But then here, he goes back on this woman. He goes back to the kind of more commonplace use of shadow when you're doing it from your imagination, where he just has one side dark, one side light. But years ago, I saw a Frida Kahlo diary. They published her journals, and they had this amazing drawing she did. She did like a sad goodbye to my leg drawing after she had her leg removed because of her all of her medical issues. And she drew the leg really quickly, and she had the shadow on both sides of it. And she even had a little bit of cross hatching in the middle. And I remember it really throwing me for a loop because it looked great. And I was like, she's not doing that classic light versus dark thing. She has darks equally on either side. So it's possible that sometimes a shadow is getting darker because something is round, it's moving away from you a little bit. Maybe it's overcast, and instead of having a strong direct light, you have just an overall kind of distilled light coming from above. So here, this is also really fascinating. You have the image of this other weird demon creature, and I always love it when artists have the confidence to say, I'm going to have a shadow that goes right over another pattern. We see the scales go right into the shadow and you don't miss a beat. And it's almost confusing because, one second, there's so many different ways to approach shadow. Let me just erase these lines. And some people might have a much this almost looks like the line art you see on a dollar bill. It's very formal and very rooted in lithograph traditions. You might have something which is a little bit more modeled and a little bit more naturalistic. Like here on the right side, the way that the shadow is done on these goat legs is very different from what you're seeing elsewhere on the body. It almost makes me wonder if the artist learned how to do animals in a different kind of, with a different strategy than he learned how to do people. Because he could have shaded this kind of like how we saw with the goat legs, where you have this bumpy surface that shows that it's hairy, and then he just has the lines coming over from the left, the way that he does here on this guy's side. But instead, he's using a shadow with a much more like all over the form kind of approach, and he's really using the lines to imitate the fibers of the hair. It's just different. It isn't that one is better, it's just different. It's good to fall back on, it's good to experiment with different techniques and to make it a really solid meditation on one technique or another. Now this guy here, again, look at how he had, like at this point, we're really deeply into cross hatching. I mean, in the early image, we had no cross hatching. And again, I don't think there's any cross hatching here. And now we're getting really firmly into the world of cross hatching. It's introduced very briefly here and here. Notice that the hatching is in the center. You usually have two lines tend to be darker than one line, and you tend to find darker tones deep in the recesses of the shadow. Like here, there's a dark rippling accent of shadow right in the middle of this overall shadow. That's pretty common. Even here in this, if you were to break down that kneecap, right in the middle of that shadow, there's a second shadow, which is darker. And that goes back to, if you've ever had a class where they've taught you about how there's 5 or 6 different components of a shadow that are on a sphere. Again, this is a really crude way to doing this. You've got your sphere. Let's see if I can make this really round. This is the worst. Okay, you got the sphere, and then you have like a mid-tone shadow, and you have a very dark shadow, and the darker shadow is usually in the center, and that's called the umbra. And then the shadow around it is called the penumbra. And penumbra, umbra means dark, pen means before, so penumbra is before dark. It's the twilight transition between extreme dark, like dark and light. So you get this kind of, it's a horrible drawing, but that's what you see here, is that you have the umbra in the middle of the shadow. The darkest part of the shadow is usually right in the middle. So also notice, going back to what I said before, this guy here has a back arm and a back leg that are really beautifully shaded. And if you try to do this, you have to really force yourself to do it the first time, because it feels very unnatural. It feels more like it doesn't feel like you're drawing spontaneously. But if you start to do it, if you start to put the back arm and back leg, or the back leg of a table and or whatever the object is, the thing which is further back, if you make it shadowed, it really is a solid device for creating an illusion of depth. Okay. This is Little Orphan Annie. Little Orphan Annie is one of my all-time favorite comics, stylistically at least. Writing's good too, but in the early Little Orphan Annies, it's done almost like one of those woodcuts that we just looked at. It's really, the artist is really in love with the line. And then in the 50s, after he'd been doing the comic for 20 years, in the 50s, comic style and illustration style got a lot inkier, lot more brush oriented. And he started to do more of a kind of a film noir type of shading. And it's funny because he's kind of crude at it, but I think sometimes when you look at cruder people, it's easier to decode what they're doing than it is on people who have a lot of finesse. So it's really nice how well this works, though it's completely divorced from this kind of idea. It's a whole different approach to doing shadow. There's little tiny blades at the edge, which root it and make it feel a little bit more rooted in those traditions of etching and hatching and feathering, but it's just enough to approximate that this shadow isn't completely flat. And it's really kind of wonderful to look at. This is also really inspiring to me. It really makes me want to just block out like big areas of shadow. Here we are back to the demonology stuff. Again, you have artists who are unafraid to do shadows that are going right over a texture. Here we have this kind of cellulite pattern or scales on this creature's right thigh and the heavy scales on the bottom. And the shadow just pile drives right through it like those shapes aren't even there. This one is interesting kind of as an example of what not to do. Though this is a great drawing, the only part that's really well modeled in terms of modeling the shadow is this arm, because the shadow here, it rises and falls. The transition between the dark area and the light area is very uneven. It's like, sorry, not uneven, but it's not smooth like this. So there's a bit of an undulating edge here. I usually tell people that the edge of a shadow should look something like the edge of a country on a map. Should be very uneven and sort of like a puzzle piece. If you do that, usually your shadows are a study in two opposites, meaning the right side of the shadow is disappearing right at the edge of the form. It's really beautifully done. And it's, as it gets over here, it goes from being a very clean, solid line to something which should be more open and organic. And that's why this works well, because it's so kind of messy and organic. Another really beautiful image. Again, the elephant is turned away from us. Back arm is in shadow. The back leg is in shadow. Again, turned away from us. Look how that whole back leg we can barely see is in shadow. This leg is is there two legs? Maybe it's just the fatness of the thigh. And here again with this leg, and here again with this arm. And then this guy's got his feet planted, and he's like, "Hey, what do you want from me?" And both arms and both legs are pretty evenly shaded. Though you can see there is a strong sense of the light source. It's clearly heavier on the right side than the left side. Again, turned away from us. And maybe this elephant came out of the same studio that produced this image. I love this too. After teaching this lesson for a little while, this little building in the background, I've used this inspiration like a dozen times, because this is real. I tend to get very busy when I start sketching in architecture. I'm not a natural when it comes to architecture. This is a really solid approximation of a little kind of, uh, asymmetrical brick wall. And all they did is just shade one side of downstrokes and one side with horizontal strokes, and put a texture over it. So I started to ask myself, well, could I do this with a wall that has a different texture on it, that's got a stucco pattern, or has a painting on it, or has a window on it, or has cracks on it? And so far, it doesn't fail me. And whenever you do this wall, the architectural shape shadowed, it just pops out what's in the foreground. This is an image I just discovered. A bit of a tangent. It's an amazing image. It's really kind of emotionally powerful. It's beautifully designed. love the kind of, it's kind of hypnotic the way that this creature's body language is. The interesting thing I didn't notice until looking at it a second time is, okay, so it's Italian. It's an Italian, and I'm not sure what year it was done, but if it was done during World War II, then it's interesting because you have the German head on the horizon, and because you can tell because it has a spiked helmet. It might be during World War One though. So it's interesting because the Italians were the Germans' ally in World War II, and so I was thinking, is this like is it propaganda that's also, in another country, in British? This is the Brits right here, and they're putting their arm around this innocent child and putting a sword in his hands, and it's supposed to be kind of horrible. They're teaching him the ways of war. It kind of seems like anti-war propaganda, but it's a bit biased because it's being done by Germany's allies. But I don't think the Italians were the Germany's allies during World War One. So the propaganda would be, if it was done by a country that was opposed against the Germans, it would be a much different type of propaganda. But amazing image here. On a technique level, a lot of pointillism. So this is Frank Frazetta, and what he does is you'll start to see that he has a lot of open outline images. Right here, you don't have a line around this guy's hip. It's don't have a line here where his thigh is. So it's implied. And this is a technique that a lot of artists really love, and painters as well. Like here, look how there's really no outlines around these figures here. There's no outline here. He's using tone to create the form. Here as well. I mean, there's a little, those brief appearances by outlines, but most of this is one tone against another. So I find that most artists have a love-hate relationship with outlines. So here, there are plenty of outlines, like on the hand. There's like a kind of a disappearing outline, but it's pretty consistent throughout the thumb and the finger. Here it's very light, but there's a lot of places like here where the artist is like kind of setting up a personal, well, he wants to have a painterly effect and feel like he's using a sophisticated sense of volume to create shape. So here the lines come right down to the edge of the arm, and the bicep is implied. We infer it, but it's not really shown to us. It's implied that it's there. And here on his lips, like I had a teacher say to me in art school, what an outline is always an abstraction. When you draw an outline around somebody's arm, it's not there in the real world. So does it represent the air between the skin and the space between the air and the skin? There is no space between the air and the skin. The air comes right up to the edge. So most you'll see it in painting a lot, that sometimes people will embrace the outline and then kind of reject it. And that's what you see here. The outline's missing. All these pockets on his shirt, pockets of shadow, they're all implied by an open-edged gray area. Just beautiful. Then occasionally the wrinkle becomes squeezed so much that it does become an outline, basically. But there is as few as possible. Even the nostril, it's not really a line, it's a grouping of lines, which makes it look like a tone. And here too, look at the grass. Just, it's why this guy, Frank Frazetta, is, he's a lot of, when I was a kid, he was everybody's favorite, every kind of nerdy comic book fan, he was their favorite artist. I love this too. I love the door in the background, how it's so ghostly and light, so it pops him forward, and kind of falls back. I also like how he's kind of getting into this playful hatching technique on the inside of the door, changing the direction constantly. Okay, so now this is, I want to say Schneiderman, Schneiderman. He's the guy who did the art for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and The Great Glass Elevator and all the other Roald Dahl books. So he also was in love with seeing if he could show his images with no outlines. Sorry, I keep on hitting the wrong button. Okay, there we go. So you can see here on this Willy Wonka's head that the outlines are all missing. Though you feel like that's the lip of his hat, but there's no line. There's no line here. There's no line here. It looks like he might have drawn it and erased it. This too, the coat, it's just all the volume of the tones are creating a dimensional effect. And then the outline of the leg is missing. And for entire books, he would just do this again and again, this entire counter. Look at the edge of that counter. So again, architecture is the hardest thing for me. It's the thing which comes the least naturally to me. So I'm always trying to visit how other people did it. This looks really fun to draw. And this could be, I often look at the kind of tangential things in people's work, and I try to steal them. So I might do this on a kitchen table, or somebody who's leaning on a counter that has a microwave on it or something. Love the doorway back here. And again, there's not a single outline on this entire image. Maybe some sketchy lines here where the glass is. Him too, this amazing kind of ghostly image. Look how the elbow is missing. Look how that line of his arm is missing. Look how this line this sleeve disappears as it comes down to the book, and this disappears. So you almost feel like to do this technique, you'd have to draw it twice. You'd have to draw the lines in there in pencil, bring the ink up to them, but not fill them in, and then erase them. This is a woman named Faith Jacques that I discovered while researching Joseph Lindelman. And she also did work for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And she has a different style, but it's interesting what a strong voice she has as an illustrator. And this is a time period where women were more of a minority of the illustration market and the comics market compared to where they are now, where I think especially in independent comics, women really dominate the field in terms of who's getting critical attention, who's popular, who's well loved on the internet. I feel like it's all women who are really leading the charge. This is her work as well. It's similar to Lindelman's. You feel like she's not dependent on the outline. There are places where there's almost not an outline. Like here, it's thick and then it's thin. It kind of disappears. Here, he doesn't have a lot outline. He has the edge of the shadow just forms his shoulder, and look at the edge of his hair. He doesn't have a line there. It just stops, and then you have the shadow behind it. So she's just as sophisticated. She's not doing as much of a formal kind of breakdown of images without outlines. This one too, it's amazing. You look at this and you feel like it's very, very solid. It's a very solid looking, industrial looking machine, but the outlines are all missing. This one too, it's just incredible. I mean, it's such a show-offy thing to do images this complex and ornate that don't have any outlines. And again, you see, the more you look for them, the less you find them. This one's great too. This is almost like a throwback to the first image we looked at, where it's a very simple image, just a light side and a dark side. But but the outline is missing, and this guy's big butt is defined perfectly, even though the upper crest of it, the crest of it is missing. This one's maybe the most spectacular image that Lindelman did. It's like, this is so sensitive what he's doing here with the paper. Just really extraordinary. And the fingers are beautiful. And again, all the outlines are missing. So what I'm going to do is, let me see how best to do this. I should probably do this on my other device. No, yeah, but I'm trying to think if I should do this on Procreate or do this on analog. I guess I could do it on Procreate, though. Hopefully you're using real ink.
Yeah. Can you just cast Procreate directly, or do you record it?
I can share from my other screen
Mhm.
and show you that way. I just have to do. Let me find a good image to copy. Second, yeah, okay.
Well,
What I'm
gosh,
gonna do is
I'm
I'm gonna
just
go back.
really responding to everything that you say because the outline is kind of this big mystery. It's like how everybody learns to draw with outlines at the very
Yes.
beginning, but it's so flattening and it's this abstract thing that's not there. One thing that I've said in this class is that the outline is never inside the figure. You know what I mean? The outline is
Mm,
always somehow on the exterior. So there
yes.
is always that question of where it actually is, you know?
Yeah, there's so many different ways to analyze it. It's like when you look at this image, it's like you get closer and closer to the edge, and it's like, yeah, the outline is way, way, way that outer crust. I also like on this image that even here, this primitive point of art history, look how abstract and expressive this outline is. It gets thick, then thin, then twice as thick, then thin again. Here
Yeah.
too, it's very cruddy looking and amazing that way, in that way, and it
Hmm.
has a real life to it because it's constantly shifting. Yeah, I was showing my students. Let me see if I have this other thing up really quick.
There's something just really beautiful about, I mean, it's exactly like you described it, but I always think of like structuring a drawing, like you're working really hard to structure a drawing, and then you have some process of removing that part of the process and moving on, being like, I'm not doing structure anymore. I'm just thinking about it in space. I'm thinking about the light and, and just having some separation because that's what you do. I mean, I think when you've never drawn before, all that you can do is structure. Like
Yeah.
that's the only thing that you focus on. But if it's a light table or switching from pencil to ink or something
Mm.
like that, and say like the structure is done and it's good enough, and now I'm going to move on to something else. Whether it's the light playing over the surface or expression or something.
Yeah. To me, structure and light are joined at the hip. Eh,
Hmm.
but what you're saying, I respond to what you're saying, and I feel like the big question is, I mean, all the genius artists were people who could have stuff that felt like it was rooted in reality and the phenomenons of nature, of how form works and how the natural world looks, and then they're able to. I mean, this guy, whoever painted this, he didn't have. I hope he didn't have a model that was tied up in this way. He is using made up ropes. In fact, the more you look at the ropes, they're
Yeah.
very stagey looking. They're also perfect and symmetrical.
Hmm.
And the quite this one too. I wonder how much of this one too clearly is out of the guy's imagination, but the folds are beautiful, the shadows are beautiful, and that's always the question. Like, how do you like pivot away from just doing studies and start to do things where you have the freedom to imagine whatever you want? This thing is amazing. This whole period of this kind of heroic um, social realist art, it's so abstracty looking. The shadow is so, it looks more like this is a big, this is a weird piece of fruit or something, or a couple of like a bent candle than a real arm, but
Right.
it feels dimensional.
Yeah, but if you just took it as an anatomy lesson and you were like looking at the accuracy of the structure, it would be kind of like garbage. But
Yeah.
there's something that is real and naturalistic when you put the structure aside and move into just your thoughts or emotions about the space, even if it's imaginary.
Yeah. And if you look at this image, there's no outlines. The gray just stops where the white is. There's not here too. It's like it's not that look. It's a very thin line where the shadow is, but then the shadow tapers around. Look at that. Then it
Yeah.
disappears. So this is classic painting, not a single outline. But then there's other painters like Diego Rivera. He's a lot like Faith Jacques. He can has those same skills, but he's like, I'm going to do an outline at the end of it. It's a big, fake looking, almost coloring book looking outline that still comparatively, that's
Yeah.
compared to some of these other painters who ignore the outlines altogether.
Hmm.
Um, it's kind of amazing.
And that's part of the appeal of Rivera, I think, is like, at he could be working from a model making something super realistic, and then at the very end he's revealing the artifice of it and showing you that it's artificial. So then
Yeah.
you're left in this space between, it's like, is it a representation or real, or is it imaginary or real? And you don't know. Like, it's
It,
ambivalent.
it's perfect. Yeah, it's perfectly said. And if you ever look at his very early work, there's a painting I saw recently that looked like Gauguin did it. It's like
Mm-hmm.
the figure was really the way they were framed, the way their body language was really well, some of Gauguin stuff actually, some of it is very sinewy and the people almost look like dancers that are about to move. Other times they look very heavy and they do look more like abstract and more like anyways, you realize that he took a step backwards to try to get an effect that he wanted that was more stagey and less real looking. It
Yeah.
reminds me of Ben Mara in some ways.
Mm.
So I'm going to do a demo real quick. And is it okay if I give the students like an assignment?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let me share from my other screen.
And I'll write this assignment up and put it in next week's folder. So it's not on top of what you're doing today.
Okay, one sec.
I
We
mean, this week's.
are, yeah, it's only it's only 3:06. I've only been talking for 35 minutes. Let's see. Image. Oh, I keep on share content. Oh, you have to make my other screen a host as well.
Oh, okay. Okay. Let's see.
Or I wonder if I can do it.
View options. Side by side mode. Shoot. Oh, something's happening.
I just turned off the one screen.
Oh, here's your other screen. Okay, I see it.
Mhm.
Make a host. Oh wait, make a co-host, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
great. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So I grabbed one of the images from the slideshow. I'm going to take this and okay. Actually, I could have done this way. It would have been easier. Yeah. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of these figures that I like, and I'm going to draw it, trying to observe, um, trying to observe the basic principles that the artist is following in terms of how the character's standing, what their body language is, and how the shadow is done. And when I give this assignment, I usually ask people, don't change it too much. Like don't go like far afield of what's going on with this figure. Like maybe you might want to, here, I'll take out the little baby that's hanging off his chest, because I just know in this fast of a demo it's going to confuse me. So I'll give him a book bag instead, so there's something hanging over them. And maybe I'll turn this hand upward, and I will just make small, I don't want to get too clever. I just want to make a few little changes. So maybe I'll go ahead and I'll give him I'll give him shoes. This way, I'm still going to be able to say, it's not like I'm drawing somebody giving a karate kick all of a sudden. Or if I did want to give him a karate kick, maybe that would be all right as long as the rest of the body was all in the same basic position. But you don't want to, sometimes people get excited and they're like, great, I'm going to do a demon that has a scorpion head, and all of a sudden you just have so many questions, like how would it look if this artist was doing a scorpion? So I'm
Mm.
going to basically keep the same lighting and allow the same body language and body proportions together. But maybe I'll give him a hook for a hand. And I'll give them a mohawk instead of this haircut. That's enough to keep me busy. Enough. It's going to raise enough questions just doing this. So now what I'm going to do is I got to make sure all these lines are closed off. And I need to say, okay, how do I get this great shading effect on the chest? This guy decided to have the shadow stop right at the pectoral.
Mm.
And I have an executive decision to make about what happens when it hits the bag. Does it stop behind it? Or maybe this part is catching light? Or does it bleed
Mm.
onto it a little bit? Kind of like the way that snake person scales, the shadow just kind of kept on drifting over them as if it wasn't even there. Or does it do both and then maybe have a little cast shadow? Is this strong? Is this a big enough shape that maybe the whole thing will be covered in shadow? Now, the other thing you see here is that there's an umbra, a kind of a dark heart of shadow inside of the larger shadow. So the biggest shadow actually is drifting all the way down his hip. That's the greater, I mean, this is all one big piece of shadow. So I might have this go all the way down this character's hip. They're wearing I'm imagining them wearing like 70s gym shorts. I might even want to do some of the cut of the short here. Maybe I'll put a stripe on it. Like I connect my lines. So it's going. And then as I mentioned, there's a big heart of darkness in the middle of this. There's an accent which really gives it dimension. So I
But it's like
continue.
the umbra is like in the center of the form.
Umbra is almost always in the center, though sometimes it's a bit of a semantics argument because sometimes the center is at the side, because here we are drawing a sphere, and usually the umbra, which is another word for black, I think, I forget what language. Somebody told me, I think once it might be Latin.
Mm-hmm.
So umbra equals black. Penumbra is before black, so it's kind of a middle ground. And at some point, the shadow stops altogether, and then you get into the light area. But you could usually block. There might be 3 tones that I'm doing right now, like deep dark,
Mm-hmm.
medium dark, light dark. Then you have your cast shadow, and then sometimes you get a rim light as well. But here, the middle is really over on the right side of it. But that's because if we took the camera and we turned it around more to where we're looking right directly here, you'd find that this shadow is we're only seeing part of the story.
Yeah.
And that's how shadows normally are. This one too. The shadow continues. If we were looking at him from the left, we would see the shadow is basically a kind of a oval like shape going right down the middle of his leg and hip and side.
Mm.
So this comes down the book bag instead of the kid. I just find that kid so hard to draw.
Yeah.
But if you were really imaginative, you could tackle it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Especially here, I'd just be afraid that the head area, that's just not going to look integrated. I don't know how they do it,
Mhm.
but you really do get the sense of the head like a join to the body. It's such a weird image. I feel like it's very hard. It's easy to blow it. So even though this isn't as fun to look at,
I
um,
think even in the original piece, it's very flat looking. It doesn't have as much
yeah,
it doesn't have as much dimension as everything else.
yeah, it's like it looks like an image that would appear on a coin.
Yeah.
Like it's a barely high relief image. So this whole entire leg is in shadow except for the knee. So the knee is like this nice little perfect pocket
Mm, gosh,
of
that's so
light.
cool.
It's so cool. And for me, my experience as an artist has been I started off with a lot of un unchanneled energy, and I would, I'd attack the page, and I'd be very I'd have a lot of trouble planning my images. The more I
Mm,
study this stuff, which is very, very um it's very, very strategic and very like type A personality, where you're like the person who did this is really building this, constructing this thing in a very methodical way.
yeah.
The more I study that, I find I enjoy that work a lot, and I'm able to take a little bit of it away and put it into my own practice. And then the more I do it, yeah, the more it appears in my own work, and the more it becomes, well, it's muscle memory. It starts to become something that I can do in a spontaneous way without it
Right.
feeling like it's this mindless, uncreative chore. But I'm kind of screwing up down there on the leg because those
Yeah.
lines are really ugly. I should have made them kind of tapering more and closer together, like the teeth of a comb.
Wow. But so what you're describing is like you're always trying to, when you discover these rules or systems, you're trying to simplify them and integrate them into your own practice so they're natural.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean, because we study like perspective in this course, but it can get so like hyper engineered and so systematic that you can walk away from really serious perspective studies without ever integrating it into your own style.
Yeah.
But what I see in just this drawing that you've done is just so it's loose and naturalistic, but it feels totally dimensional, just because you've internalized that sense from the beginning.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I keep on looking down at what the other guy is doing. I'm just trying to pretend that this guy who has a t-shirt on is the same. I'm trying to approach it pretty much the same way that he is. And
Yeah.
every time I start to slack a little bit, I try to look at it more closely. And you mentioned dimension. Let's take, just from memory, let's take that wall that I talked about before. So there's that beautiful asymmetrical wall. So that the one that I spent a lot of time talking about, where I showed how the lines on the side were straight down,
Mm-hmm.
and then these lines were sideways. So it could be a lot of buildings could look like this. Something could be further away and look like this. This might be a college campus or a hospital or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And look, when I'll put, you I'll put some cracks on the front of it. Maybe I'll
Mm,
make my line a little thinner. And
yeah.
if I go through the whole thing, just following that system, it pops him out really beautifully. So I'm like everybody else. It's like I hate doing background stuff. I hate. I if I do it, I can tend to. I have to really work hard to connect all the lines and go the extra mile of really making it look like it's solid. The smaller
Mm,
it is, the harder it is to put details in. And so when I visit what other people have done, I might be like, wow, they really put these little bushes back here. They really drew the hell out of them. Harold Gray is a great guy for that. His background buildings are wonderful. Harold Gray, the guy that did Little Orphan Annie.
yeah.
Yeah, not bad. And maybe a couple crisscrossing buildings will be even more convincing. So
Right.
again, so again, I can do. But the weird thing is, I found that once you do one shady building, you can put them next to a couple buildings that are not entirely in shadow, and it still looks really good.
Yeah, it looks even deeper because it's like there's an area of shadow and then it gets lighter further back.
Yes, agreed.
So cool. Even just, because in this class, like there's not an art major at community college at our college, which maybe there will be soon. But so some people come to drawing one and they're like, I've never drawn before, I've never even approached it. So even just learning, a cubic form has a front and a side, and
Yeah,
those have different light, you know, like the light will hit it differently no matter what, you know
yeah,
like even that is really powerful.
I agree. It's like I said at the beginning of the lecture. Every time I revisit these concepts, it sharpens my. It keeps my. It sharpens my senses a lot.
Yeah.
Here's another thing I notice about these guys: the way they do these dirty grounds is just amazing. There's a. I've been so in my own classes. One week I had my students copy, do what we're doing now, do these mythological characters, kind of using the shading and the body language, and then turning them into something else, either another mythological character or a contemporary character or some other sort of character. Um, you could be, it could be a self-portrait. Um, and then the next week, I had them really look at the way that they do dirt. What you find is that, yeah, there's a real method to it. You
Mm.
might find that there's when you look at the gouge lines on the ground, they're usually really uneven and scrapey. They look a little bit barbed, like you might have some dots here, and it's very cumulative. So if you have this, and then you have some little feathered areas next to it, and then maybe a few pebbles, at a
Mm.
certain point, there's a tipping point, and at a certain point, this will start to look so volumetric, all the lines kind of add up to something that really makes you feel like this is a rippling, kind of uneven, uh what do you call it, a field, an open field, an
Yeah.
empty lot that he's standing in. And maybe it's looking good so far. I wonder what happens when it goes right underneath his foot and comes out the other side. And you start to get a whole little diorama feeling.
Mm. And it's so cool how you have that space to establish it on one side, and then even though you don't have that much room to draw that same pattern further on in the drawing, it still asserts itself because it connects to that initial place.
Thanks. Yeah, and actually there's a whole science to how this guy did the shadow right behind them. So that's another cool thing you can do. Again, that will help you with perspective is if you put somebody on a slightly different plane, like think about how we might draw dunes in the desert. You can get away with anything without having to get too high stymied by real perspective. Because the reason perspective works is because everything's on the same plane, so the
Mm-hmm.
same principles operate on it because everything is on the same level. As soon as you have slightly different levels, really you can get away with anything. You can just have somebody who's on a little pitcher mound, a little lump of earth that's kind of rising up in front of you, and if I have like you know a little tiny uh somebody put, it's a pet cemetery and somebody put like a little handmade cross here, you basically believe it. If there's a little figure back here, I guess is a bigger cross than I thought, you believe it. And it
Mm-hmm.
all works because if you don't see where their feet are, you basically will accept what the artist is showing you.
That's super cool.
So finally I just have to do the face. I said I was going to give them a mohawk, so what if I try to do the mohawk the same way this is done? Well, I've learned this artist is drawing the hair with like a lot of overlapping
Mm-hmm.
kind of blades. So I guess I'm going to give them a um, really nice like blow dried mohawk. And then there's a lot of shadow down at the bottom. So I have to keep on zipping down there. Great. And there's beautiful light, even on this tiny little head, there's beautiful lighting on it. Light on the forehead. A light under the eye. And then there's a little bit of a character line here. And I already, that's looking more like a specific type of face than kind of the standard way that I might do faces left to my own devices. Give this guy kind of a weak chin and take off the beard. Interesting too, there's a lot of shadow right at the edge of the hair and here. So it's not, it's like the artist is really taking a very painterly approach to really making it feel like this massive hair has volume. And I think it helps that they really get in there and they render